I know, it's only rock and roll, but I like it. Now, before you ask, no, this is not Billy Joel's It's Still Rock and Roll to Me. It is the Rolling Stones, one of the greatest rock bands of all time. And to explain why they're one of the greatest rock bands of all time, I'll go into the brief history in this 10-minute speech. Now, I'll evaluate their history in 3 points. First of all, the early days of the Stones. Second, the 80s and 90s. And third, present day Rolling Stones. On to my first point of the early days of the Rolling Stones. Here we have the founding members of the Rolling Stones. First off, down here, Brian Jones, guitar player, as well as just a blues fan in general. The Rolling Stones love the blues, and that's what the Rolling Stones are based off of. They were based off playing blues music. Now, Brian Jones and drummer Charlie Watts, they both played at blues club around London. And who else loved the blues? Keith Richards and his childhood friend Mick Jagger. Now, one fateful day in spring of 1962, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger decided to go down to a blues club in London. And that day, they met Brian Jones playing the blues. And they were fascinated by his performance. They really enjoyed Brian Jones, and they were soon to become friends. Now, once the Rolling Stones were underway, they needed a bass player after the original bass player, Dick Taylor, left. So who did that bring in? Well, the bass auditioner, Bill Wyman, for the Rolling Stones. Now, after all these 5 members were put together, the Rolling Stones were underway. England's newest hitmakers, as they were called, on their first album. Here in 1964, we got the album The Rolling Stones. Depending on what region you're in, it could be called England's newest hitmaker as well. Now, after 1964, with 1965's Out of Our Heads, with very popular song Satisfaction. And then after that, 1966, Aftermath, a very popular song Painted Black. And then after 1966 Aftermath, we started seeing problems within the band. 67 became Between the Buttons, with very popular song Let's Spend the Night Together. And it was between this era right here, this era, where we saw the breaking of the band a bit, between Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, as well as Brian Jones' huge drug addiction. Even Keith Richards said that's too much, and well, if Keith Richards said that's a lot of drugs, well, it's a lot of drugs. It's not even comprehensible how bad it is if Keith Richards says it's a lot. Therefore, Brian Jones was starting to get his life consumed by drugs. Mick Jagger said in an interview with the BBC that, well, some people of fame sits well, but never sits fully well on your shoulder. But for Brian Jones, it never sat at all, not even a bit. Therefore, lots of problems between the band started happening. So, after 1967, the beginning of the year, came another album towards the end of the year. The Satanic Majesty's Request. After that, Beggar's Banquet with popular song Sympathy for the Devil. This 1968 album was the final album that Brian Jones would be fully featured on. Now, here, this era right here between 1968 and 1969 was a huge shift in the Rolling Stones. That was a loss of Brian Jones. And Let It Bleed came out in 1969. And Brian Jones was only featured on 2 tracks on the album, Midnight Rambler and You Got the Silver. Now, what happened with Brian Jones? Well, as Charlie Watts, the drummer, said in an interview with the BBC, Brian Jones was 2 things. First off, he wasn't very nice, and second, he wasn't very pleasant to be around. So, this brings us to the question of, was Brian Jones really friends with Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, or were they just co-workers? Well, he wasn't really pleasant to be around in the later days, as drugs started to consume his life and therefore hurting the band. So in 1969, he got kicked out, and 1 month later, tragedy struck when they found him dead at the bottom of his pool. Therefore, this is what happened to Brian Jones. After this came guitar player Mick Taylor, one of the greatest guitarists of all time. His first album would be Sticky Fingers, soon big hit album Exile on Main Street, and then right here, Exile was a huge blues album. But then after it, 1973's Goat's Head Soup, this is the transition from blues to a more rock group. And then especially in 1974, a huge rock album, It's Only Rock and Roll. After 1974, Mick Taylor saw a problem with himself. He acknowledged his heroin addiction. Therefore, he decided to leave the group, and they brought in Ronnie Wood in 1975. And Ronnie Wood is still with the group to this day. His first album, Black and Blue. Many people love it, many people don't like it, such as me. I'm not a huge fan of it. And this is the Right here, after Black and Blue, is the arrival of the disco era into the Rolling Stones, which brings us to Some Girls in 1978 with two disco songs such as Some Girls and Miss You. Now to my second point of the 80s and 90s for the Rolling Stones. Emotional Rescue, a huge disco song with songs Emotional Rescue and Dance Part 1. After that, Tattoo You, 1981, with big hit song Start Me Up. Soon after, Undercover and Dirty Work that did not do so well. But after Undercover in 1983 and then Dirty Work in 1986, here this arrow signifies another turbulent time in the Rolling Stones history. See, as it says here, Mick and Keith's feud. Mick Jagger had a nickname between the group members. It was B-word Brenda, except in reality it wasn't a B-word. It was actually the B-word. They didn't call him B-word Brenda. So, Mick and Keith's feud. Well, after being friends with somebody for so long and having a professional career with somebody for so long, you start to have turbulent times. And therefore, that's what started happening here. And Mick and Keith started growing further apart. But in an interview with Daily Mail in 2013, Mick Jagger stated that an apology from Keith Richards was a prerequisite. And Keith Richards, he stepped up. He was able to do it. He was the bigger man. Therefore, this will be a great time for the Rolling Stones to be together. Because after this, once they made up, came out in 1989 Steel Wheels. Soon after that, same year, the Rolling Stones Hall of Fame induction. Picture here, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Ronnie Wood, and then Bill Wyman. But after this, shortly, Bill Wyman left after this Hall of Fame induction, bringing in the arrival of Daryl Jones, the new bass player, and still with the Rolling Stones today. Bill Wyman was a great influential bassist player in all of rock and roll, not just the Rolling Stones, but he was getting older. He had at least 6-7 years above all the other members, and therefore he had to leave. He was getting old, he was getting tired. So once Daryl Jones comes in, another album, 1994's Voodoo Lounge. After Voodoo Lounge, Bridges to Babylon in 1997. This 80s and 90s era was a great era for the Rolling Stones with new introduction of disco music, but then they go back to rock music down here. Now, while the Rolling Stones were growing even bigger now, they still had a problem to face, and that was, are they getting too old? Are they going to stop touring? Well, that brings us to the present day Rolling Stones. The 2000s, so 2000 and above, 2020 now. You see, in 2005 came their last original album, A Bigger Bang. In 2016, Blue and Lonesome, a country album, but just covers of country music. After that, this year came Living in a Ghost Town, a single, which is based off essentially a city that's abandoned and barren, like it is now in the coronavirus lockdown that we had. And then now, their most recent album release, the 2020 Goat's Head Soup Deluxe Edition. The original album came out in 1973, but now they released the deluxe edition, and it's a big hit with new songs such as Scarlet, All the Rage, and Crisscross. 3 unreleased songs from 1973, now released 37 years later. Great album, and it has a lot of potential. 47 years later, actually, my bad. And then, now, brings us to present day Rolling Stones. In this picture here, we got Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Ronnie Wood, Charlie Watts. Out of the original band members, these are the only few left. Now, Daryl Jones maybe is considered a Rolling Stone, but he's not a full member yet. These are the last few full Rolling Stone members left. And they're still touring to this day. The No Filter tour was supposed to be happening, but due to the coronavirus lockdown, it wasn't able to. So, the Rolling Stones, the greatest rock band of all time. How have they been able to stay in touch? How have they been able to manage the popularity? Well, simply is having a good bond between the members, as well as just producing new music, and all their music are hits, such as Living in a Ghost Town, great song, Goat's Head Soup Deluxe Edition, All the Rage, Crisscross, Scarlet. Those 3 songs featured in this album that weren't released are great hits now. Even though they were released only a few months ago, they are now doing super well. So, the Rolling Stones have stayed relevant throughout music history, and their legacy will always stay relevant. Therefore, the Rolling Stones are one of the greatest rock bands of all time, and this is a brief explanation of their history. Thank you.